take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their back confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This is a special broadcast of the Republic News Network and Southern Broadcasting for Thursday evening. This is October 25th, and we really have a special program tonight because we've got a gentleman on this call who is really someone who can attest to the dishonesty in some of the local elections on the Indian reservations in southwest Montana. And he is also someone who can verify just exactly how out of control so many of the federal land agencies have become since Agenda 21 and since we really started to care a lot more about environment than we do about the people that are served by these federal agencies. And we've seen a lot of changes in the last 25 years as a result of the President's Council on Sustainable Development, which was put in place under Bill Clinton. And we also have seen a tremendous uptick in the number of, let's say, violent attacks and things that have happened by many of these federal agencies that were really benign agencies up until the time that Agenda 21 happened and the president started putting so many of these federal land policies in a much different light. So with that, I want to introduce our guest for tonight. Christopher Courtlander is an investigative journalist, author, and museum director, and he is the author of a really excellent book, and I just read that book, called Arrow to the Heart. And he actually owns the historic town of Garryowen, Montana. And it's located on the Custer battlefield where General Custer was defeated by the Crow and Sioux Indians. He's been there for over 25 years. He is a dealer. He's been a dealer in rare and historic artifacts for over 35 years and is a former law enforcement officer. Chris has received many prestigious awards, such as the Public Service Presidential Award from the Clinton administration in 1995, the Montana Governor's Award for Tourism Person of the Year in 2004, and was the personal assistant to Dr. Joseph Medicine Crow when he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2008. This is a very, very interesting gentleman. I really welcome you to the show, Christopher. thank you for agreeing to come on this evening and tell our listeners about all these important issues.
Dan, thank you for doing what you do to promote the truth in America, and I feel privileged to be on your show this evening. I just want to give you a little bit of background. I am the founding director of the Custer Battlefield Museum. I built the museum 25 years ago on the battlefield at Sitting Bull's Camp. We're also the only location of a tomb of a United States unknown soldier outside of Arlington and Pearl Harbor anywhere in the country, and I'm sure a lot of your listening audience have heard of the term burying the hatchet. The burying the hatchet term was born over the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier at the 50th commemoration of the battle, when two battle participants came back and shook hands to signify friendship and peace and buried the hatchet in the tomb along with the decapitated soldiers' remains. There was 27 men decapitated in the battle, and I'm very grateful to be on your show this evening.
Well, thank you, Christopher, and I know that you have one of the most interesting stories, I have to say. We enjoyed meeting one another and having a chance to spend a little time together about a week and a half, almost 2 weeks ago, at the This West is Our West conference, and that was in Whitefish, Montana. And I had the great pleasure of meeting you in person, getting a chance to really visit with you. And, you know, you have a story that I think people need to hear, because you are not, part of the Bundy raid. You're not part of what happened at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge. You're just a gentleman who ran a business, ran his museum and ran his business in Garryowen, Montana, and had absolutely no reason to have any kind of federal agents coming after you. And I really want you to be able to tell your story, because I think it's important that our listeners realize this is happening all over our country. It isn't just the Bundys, it's not just the Hammonds, it is happening all over our country. We have so many instances of this, and yours is a really, really prime example of how out of control these agencies are.
Unfortunately, Dan, you are not exaggerating. It is happening all over the country, and I'm glad to be here and to be outspoken about the outrageous overhandedness of one of the Department of the Interior's law enforcement agencies, specifically the Bureau of Land Management. The Bureau of Land Management raided me in 2005 and 2008 with a SWAT team with machine guns and sawed-off shotguns, who came into my museum with flak jackets. It was just an unbelievable experience. It's hard to even put into words. Even this long after the fact, I get wound up even thinking about what happened that day. That was March 31st of 2005, when I was surrounded in my town by 22 government vehicles and over 20 federal agents who came in and swarmed our museum. And this was all over a military button the size of a nickel. And this button was sold to me on my property by an undercover BLM agent. And that was the ruse of the search warrant, and how they got into my location with the search warrant, which was totally invalid. They lied to a federal judge to gain the application for search warrant, hoping that once they got inside our facility, they were going to be able to find something wrong. But while during the raid, I just want to mention the behavior of the federal agents from the Bureau of Land Management. When they came in here, they used machine guns, and they took down our interns that are here with bachelor's and master's degrees with automatic weapons to the back of their head, laid down on the floor with their arms and legs spread. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. Their barrel was actually touching one of the heads, the rear of the heads of one of my interns that had a master's degree, and he was in that position for 7 minutes. What they're hoping during these raids and what's going on is they're training these agents in the federal law enforcement academy in Georgia, when they do these raids, to be overhanded and to be overzealous, hoping that you're going to plead to a crime that you didn't commit just so they can get another chink on the chalkboard of a conviction. I'm here to tell you tonight, Dan, I'm the only person out of the Gibson Guitar raid, the Custer Battlefield Museum raid, the Bundy raid in Nevada, and the Four Corners raid in Blanding, Utah, that did not get indicted, did not get arrested, did not turn into a confidential federal informant, did not forfeit property, and did not commit suicide. Now, the reason your audience is probably thinking, why would he say that? Because there's 4 people that committed suicide subsequent being questioned and raided by these overzealous Bureau of Land Management agents. One of them was Dr. Red from Blanding, Utah, who was 69 years old, just months from retirement, and had delivered over 3,800 babies, was a community doctor, and his home was raided, and they stormed over 100 federal agents through his home and handcuffed him and told him that he was going to lose his medical license, that he would never see his family again, that he would forfeit his property, and he was going to go to prison for the rest of his life. That evening, he drove his Jeep down to the pond at the bottom of his property and took his own life. That's just one of the examples of the people that lost their life. And I would just want to mention that artifact that Dr. Red was raided for was smaller than a eraser head on a pencil.
And he didn't actually, it was his wife that had collected it. Am I correct in that?
Right, and there's nothing wrong with possession. It's how you acquire the artifact. But you get these young, uneducated agents who read 5 pages of a federal law that might be over 100 pages long, and they get an application for search warrant filled out and go to a federal judge and lie to them. But I want to explain one thing to your audience. We're talking about a raid in Blanding, Utah, a raid at the Custer Battlefield Museum in Gary Owen, Montana, a raid of Gibson Guitar in Nashville, Tennessee, and a raid in Cody, Wyoming, where amateur geologists happened to pick up a rock and take it home, and was raided by the BLM, and he took his life 2 years ago on Christmas Eve after being interrogated like a terrorist because of these BLM agents. So let's just put this in perspective for a moment, Dan. We're talking about ebony wood on guitars that was brought into the United States, that the application for search warrant with Gibson Guitar was under the Lacey Act. And the Lacey Act was a federal law that was passed by Congress in 1988 to help protect rainforests in different countries. And in the Lacey Act, it says if you're going to export wood from rainforests, the wood needs to be worked. In other words, the wood needs to have some type of labor spent on it by the exporting country. Well, the wood we're talking about specifically was ebony wood that was being exported from Bangladesh, and it was worked, it was sanded. But when it got to our borders, our Federal Fish and Wildlife and the Department of the Interior said it wasn't sanded enough. Now, I just want to explain, this is not an exaggeration. What I'm saying is 100% accurate. The exporting country signed off on the export papers saying the wood was worked, but our government said it wasn't worked enough, it wasn't sanded enough. And that was the probable cause on the application for search warrant when they went in and swore in front of a federal magistrate the reason they needed to raid Gibson Guitar with machine guns. Not once, but twice. So we're talking about ebony wood on guitars. We're talking about a military button at the battlefield. We're talking about the Bundy's cows eating grass and we're talking about an amateur geologist picking up a rock and taking it home. So all of these people had no criminal background, and also the raid that happened in Blanding, Utah. All the 24 homes that got raided in southern Utah, nobody had criminal backgrounds. So why is our federal government have an internal federal police department policing U.S. citizens that are taxpayers with no criminal background with machine guns? Something is wrong in America.
It is. And I have to tell you, Chris, and I really want to bring this into the discussion because all of this has happened. All of these federalized police agents who are now part of our land agencies, our federal land agencies, and other what used to be benign agencies are all part of the Patriot Act, and all this has happened since 9/11. All this has happened because of the Patriot Act, and frankly, so many of these agencies, it's turned into a money game, and I think that's where I want you to kind of fill in the blanks, because that is what it's all about. It's about getting an appropriation. They made cops out of federal land agencies, and then they make them perform to do certain things so that they can justify the money that they're being paid out of the federal budget. Am I right on that?
You're 100% correct on that, Dan. After we got invaded by the terrorists that brought down the World Trade Center, George W. had no choice but to pass some type of rapid bill through Congress and the House and the Senate to make sure that we had enough to arm agents in case we were going to get invaded. And that's what the Patriot Act basically did. It was supposed to be temporary, and it was supposed to not renew, and it was supposed to vaporize. But every year since then, those provisions have been renewed. So what that did is before 9/11, we had approximately around in between 8,000 and 9,000 sworn federal armed agents inside of our government, meaning the FBI, the Border Patrol, the DEA, the U.S. Marshals. Those were all in place, and we need those agencies 100%. But what happened at the Patriot Act, every cabinet head of the president's cabinet, each one of the secretaries got their own federal quasi-military police department. That means EPA, Department of Education, HUD, or the Bureau of Land Management, Federal Fish and Wildlife. You can go right down. Every one of the secretaries has their own little private, I call it private, police department that they can go out and terrorize U.S. citizens. And why do I say that? This is why. Because the federal agents that got hired for these agencies, they get paid a huge salary, some of them over $100,000 a year. So when you get these agencies created and the genie is out of the bottle, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. They're not going to defund these agencies. So in the case with the Department of the Interior, William Woody, who heads the Bureau of Land Management Law Enforcement, gave a directive to his special agents in charge to go out and target high-profile people and businesses so he could gain national publicity so they could justify their budget in front of Congress October 31st. So October 31st is our fiscal year for Congress, and the budget for the Bureau of Land Management Law Enforcement is $261 million every 12 months. That's $250 million every 12 months for 211 Bureau of Land Management agents. Outrageous. Let me just say that again. $261 million for 211 agents. That's over. I mean, that's over $1 million
per agent. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And they need to get reappropriated October 31st so they can keep their monster law enforcement agency alive. So they had too much money in their coffers to go back and justify in front of Congress. They needed another $250 million. So William Woody came up with this plan. Let's go out and spend some of this money. Like in my case, they spent $2.6 million over 4 years and 8 months investigating me over a military button and other crimes that they alleged that I committed and that they wanted me to plead to. They first gave me a draft indictment of 9 felonies with 89 years in prison and to forfeit my town and never see my family again. Over nothing. They don't care about the U.S. citizens that has no criminal background, that's paying their taxes, that fund their wages. They're only interested in their paycheck. And they're only interested in creating high-profile raids so they get national publicities to justify their appropriations from Congress. But this is one of the other problems, Dan. When they do these raids, these are overzealous federal agents that come in and they start pointing guns at your head. And they talk to you like you're a terrorist. And they interrogate you like you're a terrorist. I have a locked room of artifacts here. And when I was raided, they found a little artifact box with a glass top on it with old bones in it. And when I built the museum back in 1993, I discovered these bones. And under federal law, NAGPRA, Native American Graves Repatriation Act, there's a provision in there that if you discover bones within a battlefield or an Indian reservation, you need to turn them into the government to make sure they're not human remains. In case they are American Indian remains, they need to be repatriated. So I did that. And they got sent back to me with a National Park Service archaeologist letterhead from Dr. Douglas Scott stating they were sheep bones and buffalo bones and they weren't human remains. But during the raid, Doug Gossman, who is a federal fish and wildlife agent, held them 3 inches from my nose for 10 minutes and berated me and belittled me and said, "These are little girl bones. Where is she buried? You're going to prison for the rest of your life for homicide." And I thought, oh my God, how did this happen? How can I have a federal agent inside my museum and within 3 hours he's telling me I thought they were framing me. But, you know, what they're doing is they're breaking you down to nothing so that you will plead to a crime so they can get another, like I said, chink on the chalkboard. Because if they don't get the chink on the chalkboard, they don't get the attaboy and they can't justify their appropriation. And a matter of fact, because I was never charged or never indicted with a crime, a lot of the federal agents involved in my investigation were either fired or transferred to another federal law enforcement agency. That's what they do, Dan. They just transfer the people around.
Yeah. Well, and I have to say, if they were going to pick someone to try to terrorize and intimidate, they sure picked the wrong guy with you. Well, tell our listeners how much this has cost you and how many years of your life have been tied up in fighting this stupid battle that obviously they're wasting taxpayers' money and they had nothing to indict you for in the first place.
Well, I have spent over $400,000. I keep repeating it, I was never charged with a crime. And just for the record, for this phone call, I am not suicidal.
Yeah. That's an important thing. We learned that with all the Arkancides that happened under the Clinton administration, too.
Yes, my attorneys are reminding me that every radio or TV show that I do that I mention that phrase that I am not suicidal, which I'm not. But they, the horrible thing here is the Patriot Act militarized all these agencies, and now we have this monster that we're trying to get rid of and try to demilitarize. Now, it's just not me being outspoken. Former Congressman Jason Chaffetz has a House bill, H.R. 622, to demilitarize part of the Department of the Interior law enforcement, and to give the authority from Bureau of Land Management back to the county sheriffs, because the county sheriffs are the chief law enforcement officer of every county in the United States. Let me say that one more time. The county sheriffs are the chief law enforcement officer of every county inside the United States. Not the FBI, not the BLM, but the county sheriff. And before we had BLM, the county sheriffs were taking care of these laws. So what HR 622 what HR 622 does is flows federal money to the counties so they can enforce some of these federal laws, and they can refer people to the U.S. Attorney's Office if they happen to stumble on somebody committing a crime. We do not need federal agents of the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Land Management, terrorizing people to the point where they take their own life. I can't emphasize that too much. We have a big problem here, Dan, and
we do.
I do want to tell your listening audience and you that Jay Redd, who is the son of Jay Redd is the doctor son of James Redd. We just got back from Washington, D.C. last Friday, and we met with the top officials of the Department of the Interior to brief them on my book. And let me just mention my book. It's Arrow to the Heart, The Last Battle at the Little Bighorn, the Custer Battlefield Museum versus the federal government. And I would ask your audience, if they want to know more about that, they can go to Amazon and just look up Arrow to the Heart. Jay and I just returned this past weekend, from a high-level meeting with directors and undersecretaries of the United States of America Department of the Interior. They promised us that they would read all of the information regarding all of these federal agents, and if they deemed there was misfeasance, malfeasance, or felonious behavior, that they would fully investigate it, and they gave us their word. They also apologized profusely to Jay Redd 9 times during our meeting over the loss of his father and the behavior of the Bureau of Land Management, and specifically the conduct of William Woody and Agent Dan Love. And I just want to mention, now that we brought up Dan Love, former Agent Dan Love is the reason, thank God, that federal Judge Navarro out of Nevada dismissed the Bundy case and released the Bundys from prison. Because Mr. Wooten, who is a senior federal agent in the Department of the Interior, wrote the Wooten Memo, W-O-O-T-E-N. You can Google Wooten Memo Kill Book. That's right, K-I-L-L, Kill Book. Because former Agent Dan Love had a kill book and a suicide list that he was bragging about, and that he had names written down of people that he wanted to kill and people that killed themselves. So we have a federal agent that takes an oath to uphold the laws of the United States and the archaeological laws of the United States. And what does he do? He creates a kill book, because after his interrogation, it's a contest to him if he can drive the people to the edge so they take their life. Now, when's the last time in your life you've ever heard of a federal agent having a kill book inside of our boundaries?
Well, as a matter of fact, Dan Love's name has come up several times, and I know certainly they have some of these agents that are very, very zealous, and he's certainly one of them. And if you've got time, I'd like to, we need to get into the issue of Jon Tester, but if you've got time, which I believe we do, I would like to talk about that instance in Blanding, Utah, where all these people who were basically collectors and very, very benign situation, how that turned into the mess that it did, and ultimately their inside informant killed himself.
Yes, that was an amazing thing that transpired, because what the Bureau of Land Management is, they funded Ted Gardner, who was a drug addict and a convicted felon, with over $300,000 in pay over 2 years and over $500,000 to go set up these 24 families that were collecting artifacts from what they say that was public property. But a lot of this collection was legal because in ARPA, Archaeological Resource Protection Act, you can legally pick something up off the ground if you don't use a tool. It's called surface finds. And President Carter in 1977 would not sign the ARPA bill to make it into law unless they put a provision in there that surface finds were legal to collect and to possess, because he was a Boy Scout leader. And he used to take his Boy Scouts out to pick up arrowheads, which is an American pastime.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how that happened. And Ted Gardner took his own life. He was a federal informant for the Bureau of Land Management. He shot himself in the head one day before the first federal trial that was going to transpire, that started the Blanding prosecution. And by the way, they didn't get one felony conviction out of there, and most of them were either dismissed or ended up with misdemeanors. And before we talk about Tester, Dan, I just want to talk about one more thing. Remember, and I've been having somebody inside the government send me some leaked documents, and that's the basis of my book, a 57-page leaked document that is the foundation for Arrow to the Heart, The Last Battle at the Little Bighorn. And I want to give your listeners my website, because a lot of these documents are posted on my website, and it's a wealth of information. The website is arrowtotheheartbook.com, arrowtotheheartbook.com. And we have the 57-page leaked document on that site. But in that document, it mentions that back in 1993, remember when the World Trade Center was bombed in the basement and it didn't come down?
Right.
We had one of our federal fish and wildlife agents. His name is Kelvin Smith, and his son happens to be an NFL player also. But Kelvin Smith Sr. was a federal fish and wildlife agent, and while in a government suburban on government time, he was supplying AK-47s to the blind sheriff Ramsey Yousaf's terrorists and training him in Pennsylvania. What did they have in common? They were both Muslim. Kelvin Smith was Muslim, and the terrorist he was training was Muslim. Well, Kelvin Smith got caught, and he got convicted. But since he was a federal agent, he only got 1 year and 1 day in jail. But the reason I'm bringing this up now is we have a federal agency that's training federal agents that are training terrorists. Why is that important today? Well, obviously, they don't do the background check well enough before they become a federal law enforcement officer, number one. But number two, remember 3 months ago in New Mexico that we had the Muslim that was training the 11 school shooters? Well, that just happened to be the son of one of the terrorists that Kelvin Smith, the federal fish and wildlife agent, was training back in 1993. So if your listeners want to know more about that, here are the keywords to Google. Just Google Muslim New Mexico World Trade Center bombings, and you can see the connection. It's amazing.
Wow, that is amazing. And the thing is this isn't the first time that we've heard this on our show. There are other people who have alluded to similar things, and it's surprising. We've talked about the deep state with some of our other guests, and how the FBI and the Justice Department have been working together, colluding in many ways to try to overthrow this president and stop this president from accomplishing many of the things that he's tried to reform the government to bring us back to a more constitutional government. And it's just amazing to me how many of these federal agencies and these federal agents are tied in with this. We've really lost control of our own government, and that's just the long and the short of it.
Yeah, there's two phrases that people say that are misused too much in this: the deep state and drain the swamp. And I'm here to tell you, Dan, right now, they're not used enough. There is a deep state, and thank God we have President Trump as president. And I hope and pray that he gets the job done of draining the swamp, which is almost an impossible feat in Washington, D.C. But I can tell you this, all the stars are lining up. I'm just praying that this election goes well, and that President Trump continues his mission and his campaign promises. And speaking of campaign, let's start talking about voter fraud on Indian reservations.
Good,
because
that's exactly where I was heading, and that was how we were going to talk about the deep state. Go ahead. You've got a tremendous amount of experience because you're right there on the reservation. You've watched a number of elections occur. You've seen some very illegal activities as far as the distances and the things that have gone on in the reservation, and I really want you to tell our listeners exactly how all this has happened.
Well, on some of the Montana Indian reservations, we have what they call a Public Law 280 reservation. And the one that I'm on happens to be a Public Law 280 reservation. It's a complicated definition, and there's a Wikipedia page on it. If you Google or if you go to Wikipedia, Public Law 280, and you can read all about it. But basically what it is, some of the tribal governments opt out of state jurisdiction, criminal and civil. So what does that mean? That means that an enrolled American Indian inside the exterior boundaries of an Indian reservation in Montana can go 120 miles an hour, be intoxicated, doesn't have insurance, doesn't have a driver's license, gets pulled over by a Montana highway patrolman, and he says, can you please slow it down, have a nice day, because he has no jurisdiction over that American Indian, criminally and civilly. So there's no civil law or no criminal law that applies to an American Indian on a non-public law 280 reservation. So on this reservation, we have 9 polling places. And those polling places are located on tribal trust property, and they're run by American Indians. So when we have Corey Stapleton, the Secretary of State of Montana, when he takes office, he guarantees the sanctity of that polling place on the reservation, but he can't guarantee the sanctity because there's no jurisdiction. In other words, if somebody is caught committing election violations or election fraud, the county sheriff can not come in or arrest them or cite them because there's no jurisdiction here and there's no law, so technically there's no crime. So what happened in 2006 when then State Senator Tester was running for the federal senatorial seat against Conrad Burns, Republican, our county, Bighorn County, was the last county to report in the nation, ironically. I mean, I just can't believe that, but it was. Montana was the last state, and this was the last county. So what happened in the final moments here? I'll explain. We had people that were dead that were voting 2 or 3 times. We had American Indians that were admitting on the record that they were told to go to different ballot polling places on the reservation and vote 2 or 3 times under maiden names, surnames, other names that they had, because they are able to get their name changed very easily, not like us, because they have a tribal court system that streamlines them. And they were able to double vote and create all these other votes. So when the polling place was closed, our non-Indian poll watchers were ordered off of the property, which is against Montana state law, but since it doesn't apply here, it doesn't make any difference. So they were were basically kicked out of the polling place with unlocked ballot boxes, and the locals had possession of the ballot boxes for 4 hours before they were transported to the county courthouse 14 miles away, with no other poll watchers inside watching them. That's number one. Number two, Senator Tester's staff, State Senator Tester's staff back in 2006, was guaranteeing $40 for every individual that would come to the polling place and vote for Tester. How do I know that? Because I saw it with my own eyes. 30 feet in front of the polling place, we had the Democratic Party, and I think I sent you copies of the checks, didn't I, Dan?
Yes, we've got them actually posted on our announcement for the radio show. So hopefully they're getting a lot of traction around the country.
Excellent. Well, I filed a $35,000. I was a plaintiff in a $35,000 federal lawsuit to expose this misbehavior and malfeasance and misfeasance that were being committed by the Tester campaign back in 2006. So when you hear the phrase "every vote," and 2 days after the election, all these Democratic checks were coming to my place of business in my town because the locals wanted to cash them. So after cashing 3 or 4 of them, I thought this was kind of odd. So I went to the copy machine and I made copies of these checks, and those are the checks that are posted on the website that you just mentioned. So I made copies of the evidence, and they were part of our federal lawsuit. So we're just not making this up. It actually transpired. Why is this important? Because it was the 2,800 votes here in Bighorn County that tipped the scales from Republican majority to Democratic majority in the Senate in 2006. So when you hear the phrase, "every vote counts," I am here to tell you every vote counts, and we need the listening audience listening to this show to make sure that you go to the polling place in a few weeks or in about less than 2 weeks and bring your friends, because we need to bring out the vote. This is probably the most important election of your lifetime.
Yeah, I think so. As a matter of fact, Chris, I've said this, and I believe that this may be the most important election in the history of our country, because it will determine whether we continue to live as a constitutional republic or we officially become a Marxist socialist democracy.
You're 100% accurate, and I know I'm praying every day that things go smooth and we get through this next election and President Trump can make good all of his other campaign promises. I mean, he's been one president that's been remarkable. Just for if nothing else, his campaign promises mean something to him. And he's showing that the people that put him in office, that he has the wherewithal to keep his word as a political figure. I mean, he keeps saying he's not a politician, and he's really not a politician. And that's why he's getting things done.
Yeah, absolutely. And he cares a lot more about our country and about our Constitution than any president has in recent history. And he really he is a nationalist, but he is a U.S. sovereignty president. And frankly, I think we've had nothing after Reagan. We've had absolutely nothing but progressive socialists of one form or another moving our country into global government. And I think they literally thought they had a slam dunk, and when Trump won, it just blew them away. And that's why they're attacking him and everything he does with such a violent and vicious voice and such a vicious way.
You know, you're right. It did absolutely blow them away, and that's exactly what's happening. Dan, I want to mention again my trip to Washington, D.C. to meet with, I'm not going to mention any names because they gave me their word that they are going to dig into the malfeasance and misfeasance of these overzealous federal agents that are operating outside the law, and I want to give them the opportunity. But I will tell you this. that from the head under President Trump and Secretary of the Interior Ryan Zinke and his undersecretaries of the Interior, they are committed to the president. They told us during the meeting that they are totally committed, watching the president's back, making sure the president's agenda gets executed, and Ryan Zinke, the Secretary of the Interior, has the full faith and credit of the president, and Ryan Zinke has empowered his undersecretaries to help drain the swamp. Just 2 weeks ago, when you and I were in Whitefish, Montana, at the New Code of the West conference, the day before the meeting, there was somebody sent me an email with an article that the Department of the Interior reprimanded or fired 1,500 employees. And that was 1 week before my meeting in Washington, D.C. So they're not only, talking the talk, they're walking it, and they're making it happen.
Boy, that's so important because, that has been the biggest problem that I believe that President Trump has faced, is that with so many progressives in the Republican Party and virtually the entire Democratic Party being progressive socialists, they've been slow walking all these appointments that Trump wants to get in place, and they still, at this late stage, 2 years after he was elected, we have still in place over 70% of all the federal agency heads of, under the very upper heads of these agencies, about 70% are still Obama appointees, and that is absolutely wrong, that they've not allowed his appointments to take over those agencies literally in every administrative capacity.
Yes, too bad that can't be streamlined more, and I totally agree with you. I can tell you this, that the DOI, the appointed positions, and the management, before you get to the bureaucracy, is 100% Trump or 100% Ryan Zinke. So they're on top of it. They know they have a problem. They know they want to fix it. They have the authority of the White House and of the Secretary of the Interior to go ahead and fix the problem. I'm just hoping that once it gets to the Senate, I will tell you this. I was told by a senator's office, and I'm not going to get in front of the story, but I was told in 2019 they're going to reintroduce former Congressman Chaffetz's bill under a different senator, and it's going to be stronger and even more powerful to demilitarize the Bureau of Land Management law enforcement and try to give the authority for that division back to the county sheriffs and try to get away from law enforcement inside the Department of the Interior when it comes to Bureau of Land Management. It's a waste of money. When I said $261 million for 211 agents, the budget of BLM is $1.4 billion. A separate budget for law enforcement is $261 million for 211 agents. It's a waste of money. They need to do a lateral transfer and put those federal agents on the border so they can fight to keep our enemies outside of the United States of America.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree with that, Chris. And the thing that we need to do, and this is something that I think President Trump is going to work on, but we really need to end the Patriot Act because that is one of the most unconstitutional political acts that we've had in our country, and it's been too long. It's been for 17 years we've had the Patriot Act in place, and there's no reason that we should continue to do all these things that are unconstitutional.
Yeah, can you believe it's been 17 years? That's amazing. And you're right. That needs to end it. And this new bill that's going to come out in 2019 might be the beginning of that. So just everybody that's listening to this radio show, keep tuned to 2019 and keep tuned to helping us demilitarize the Bureau of Land Management. We don't need an internal federal police department policing U.S. citizens with no criminal background over nonviolent crimes with machine guns.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we've seen some real tragedies at the This West is Our West conference that we attended. Jeanette Finicum was there as a speaker, and she actually did a premiere of her movie about her husband's life, and that was Lavoie Dead Man Talking. And really, it shows just how out of control these agencies are, because with the filming and everything else that we saw, there was no question. It was an ambush. It had nothing to do with Lavoie Finicum threatening anyone. It was an ambush, and they have all the proof that it was an ambush. And since when do federal land agencies ambush citizens just because they don't like their politics?
Yeah, exactly, because we have mentally deranged federal law enforcement agents that should not be wearing the gold badge that say U.S. on it. Some of these graduates that get out of the Federal Law Enforcement Academy, and remember, I'm a former law enforcement officer. Some of these guys that get this badge, we have a term when you're a cop, it's called badge heavy. And if you're badge heavy, you change personalities once you get that power. And that's what we have a major problem. And I'm not saying every federal law enforcement agency is bad, and I'm not saying that every federal agent is bad. I'm saying we have a lot of bad apples that we need to get rid of. Instead of threatening people over cows eating grass, or museums with military buttons, or a Gibson guitar with ebony wood, or a geologist picking up a rock, instead of threatening them and trying to prosecute them, why doesn't the United States Attorney's Office look at these agents that are wasting our taxpayer dollars and committing crimes by lying to federal agents, committing crimes by lying to federal judges to get application of search warrants turned into search warrants? Those people are criminals.
Absolutely. We've talked about the FISA Act and how that has been perverted to do a lot of things that were never intended when the FISA warrants were first proposed. And what it boils down to is that there are a number of people in these federal agencies that will openly and purposely lie to get a warrant just because they hope that they can uncover something on someone, and that's when government is really out of control.
You know, Dan, that's an exactly apples and apples comparison, talking about the FISA warrants that were perpetrated on then candidate Trump. That's exactly what happened in our cases and many cases with the Bureau of Land Management. These federal agents think they're above the law and that they can lie to federal judges to get these application of search warrants turned into search warrants. Because let me just explain briefly how that happens. When you have probable cause, a federal agent goes to a federal judge and raises his right hand, and he swears to the federal judge what the federal judge is about to hear is true and accurate to the best of the federal agent's knowledge. And then the judge signs the search warrant. So when the FISA court happened, and when the federal agents went up to the FISA judge and told them the lies regarding the dossier and all this other junk that came out over the news that was not true, they lied to the federal judge. The federal judge thought they were telling the truth and signed the search warrant, and that's how they got in to President Trump's attorney's office, and that's how they got the FISA application turned into search warrants for the wiretaps on President Trump. It's the misfeasance and malfeasance of these rogue federal agents that's part of the deep state that needs to be drained. The swamp needs to be drained in Washington, D.C.
Oh, absolutely. And you said something that was really spot on. I know a lot of different people that work for the federal government that are some of the nicest people, some of the most legitimate people I've ever met. We're not talking about that. We're not talking and saying that every federal law enforcement agent is out of control. What we're saying is that we've lost control of the control mechanism that assured that our federal agencies were working in the best interest of the American people. That's what we've lost control of. And in the process of losing that control, that's how so many of these agents that have gone rogue have been able to get away with what they've gotten away with.
Yeah, these overzealous agents should be working for LAPD or LA County Sheriff's Office, where they have felony call after felony call after felony call, and they can get some of the adrenaline and be super cop out there in those areas and fight the real crime. We don't need Bureau of Land Management fighting crime that they have to create. They're creating all these raids for nothing, just to justify their paycheck. And that's the dangerous part of this whole thing. With President Trump and the FISA warrants, they were creating it because they hated Trump. But the whole point is, with police departments have internal affairs. The Bureau of Land Management doesn't have internal affairs like that. They have the Office of Inspector General. So they have an arm's length distance from oversight. So when these guys get the power, they can do what they want because nobody's watching them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. And if, in fact, they do get in trouble, 9 times out of 10, they'll just get transferred to another department or get even, in some cases, they actually get promotions to move them out of the department they're in and move them into another area. And that's wrong. That is really wrong.
You're right about that, Dan. When they get in trouble, they get promotions. Dan Love, the agent who is now not working for the Bureau of Land Management anymore, former agent Dan Love got Agent of the Year award for the Blanding raid and the suicides. In 2009, insane. He got Agent of the Year award for federal law enforcement for the United States of America. And then ultimately they caught him in the malfeasance and misfeasance, and now they're investigating his kill book because we have multiple dead bodies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know that what happened certainly at the Bundy standoff was so much different than what I think the average American heard through the mainstream media, but in fact Dan Love was in charge of that operation as well. Chris, I hate to say it, but we've run out of time, but I want to give you a minute just to tell our listeners how they can learn more about you, how they can get your book, and how they can really investigate for themselves these canceled checks to that were made out to Indian citizens on the or let's say tribal members on the reservation if they voted for Jon Tester.
And Dan, I want you to give out your website first because I don't have that right in front of me. Do you? For the canceled checks that are listed.
Okay, we will have this on my danhappel.com site after the broadcast. Within a few days, we get those archived copies up on the website. So we will have that on danhappel.com, but we also have it sent out through Republic News Radio 101, and it will be rebroadcast this weekend on Southern Broadcasting. So please check these different sites out, and we will make sure that we make this information available because it's important that our listeners be able to see these canceled checks. They are there. They are pretty obviously just exactly what Chris said, and they cashed them at your business, and that's why it's so important. Anyway, please tell our listeners as much as you can about how they can find out more about your work and the things that you're doing, as well as your book, Arrow to the Heart.
Thanks, Dan. My website is arrowtotheheartbook.com, arrowtotheheartbook.com, where you can go. We have a lot of the documents that we spoke about on this radio show posted up on there. Also, you can go to Amazon. We have 5-star rating on Amazon regarding the book. It's under Crimes and Nonfiction Crimes and Corruption, Government, and is doing very well. Also, the email, if anybody would like to email me with any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. It's a simple one. It's info, I-N-F-O, at arrowtotheheartbook.com. Info, I-N-F-O, at arrowtotheheartbook.com. And keep tuned to 2019 because I think there's going to be a lot of changes regarding the subject that we talked about tonight. And Dan, I want to thank you again for what you do for America, getting the word out and connecting the dots.
Well, thank you, Chris. And again, I want to thank you for being such a terrific guest and having the guts to get on the air and say what you say, because this is so important. And with that, I want to remind our listeners, get out and vote and take someone else to the polls with you. This will be the most important election, I believe, in American history. So it's so important that we save our nation, and we have the chance. So please get out and vote. And Chris, thank you again, and I look forward to the next opportunity to have you on one of my radio programs.
Excellent. Thank you to your listening audience, and goodbye from Gary Owen, Montana.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank our listeners and ask them to tune in again next week to hear another program in Connecting the Dots.